Or if that's an awful long story, Ollie. My father was born in the town. They were originally from Kilmacshan in Inistake, and they came here around 1890, I'd say. But he had an aunt had established a business above in Maurice Street, opposite Greer's shop. They had 2 or 3 shops there, and she was a Kavanagh, and she married my grandmother's uncle, who was a Foley, and he owned the old Morrises on the manor. They were millers. And my grandfather then came to work in Morrises, in Foley's, the manor mills, and that's where he met his future wife. They were quite a young couple. They got married in St. Pat, they lived in Michael Street over the shop, and then they married in St. Patrick's Church. I think it was the 6th or the 1st of June 1900, and they moved into the quay. Then they had a pub and a grocery on the quay for many years. But she died very young, in the early 20s. She died. She was only a young woman at the time. She left 4 young kids, and that's where. Yeah, and my mother came from England about 1930 something, from Manchester. Our mother was Northern County Cavan woman, and our father was from West Waterford, and he'd come back from the First World War. And she started to work in, her father was dying, there were 6 of them in Ferrybank, they were in a house in Ferrybank. And she got a job in the battery factory down near Geelong, someplace there, but she didn't like it. And up to when she died at just 95, you could still see the burn of the acid on her fingers and hands from working at 14 years of age. So she went to the Sack and Bag company. She heard there was jobs going there, and when she went up, she met a man called Cecil de Courcy, and he was a partner of the famous William Watt, the singer. And when he heard her name and heard her accent, she probably sounded a bit different, and her Christian name was Ada Scanlon, spelled with an O instead of an A. And he said he once knew a man called Maurice Scanlon. And she said, "Oh, my daddy is Maurice Kavanagh." He said, "It wouldn't be him, this man is in England." Well, she said, "We came from England." So it turned out himself and his 2 brothers, they'd fought the First World War with her father. They were mates. Little did he think after all them years he'd meet someone. So she went working in the house in Newtown, belonged to them, to rear their 2 children. So that's where they... And my father was going to Australia the same year, 1944, when she had only met him that summer. And he said he wasn't going to spend another year, he said, in the house, because his father had died in the early 40s. And she said, "Wouldn't you get married? Would you marry me?" And she said she would, and they went off and got married, and that was it. They lived happily for...
So he never went to Australia?
No. He had all these papers done, and one of them cheap flights or first shipping thing long ago.
That's interesting about your mother and how she got... When you say the Sack Bag, was that jute factory?
They, I'd say, were a break-off maybe from the jute factory. No, they were a break-off from Henry Denny's in O'Connell Street. And they were a brother of D. Denny, I should say. Henry Denny was the meat people, or the sausage people. They were 2 brothers. One was at one side of O'Connell Street, and the other was at the other side of O'Connell Street, on the opposite side of the street. They're still Denny's Sacks. You know, Gerard Denny, he'd be the same family.
And then, did you always live down off Carnegie?
We did. They moved, my grandfather moved from the quay, he was a widower then, and he moved into King's Terrace, and we've been there since kind of the 30s sometime we moved in there.
And King's Terrace, were they originally military houses?
They say they were, Ollie, they were built originally as, what would you call them?
Jailers?
No, they weren't. Eventually they became jailers' houses, but they were built originally for some of the business people, the merchants' houses they were known as. And it was, at one stage, there was people called Wallies, had a business in O'Connell Street where Henry D. Keane used to be. They were painters and decorators, and they had a shop there. And their father was Peter Wally. And when he married a girl called Pope from Portlaw, they were given a present to that estate. It was called the Wally Estate. And it remained kind of in that, that's the name is still on if you went back on the old papers. but it was eventually used as a part of the jail. And so were the houses in Lower Barker Street. They call it King's Terrace now, because there was an old man living there when we were kids, and his name was Paddy Tierney, and he was a sergeant in the First World War, and he had fought in the Boer War, and he married his childhood sweetheart, who was Min Troy, next door neighbour, and had a family there. Like, the history that man took with him when he went, was unbelievable, I suppose.
And then you would have really good area memories of this area.
I would.
So as a child, what was your memories?
It was a very, very busy street. I wouldn't say a huge shopping street, but you would have, in our time, between here and Gladstone Street, say you had the post office, you had Harvey's Penny Bank, you had Hugh Lupus, the bookmakers, you had the 3 banks in the street, you had 3 butchers, you had O'Brien's, Kevin O'Gorm, God rest his soul, and his family, and you had Bowes at the other end of it. And you must have had several of the prominent solicitors in town at the time. Like Peter O'Connor was there, is now in Adelphi Quay, and you had Dr. Coonahan, and you had the Halleys in Georgia Street. So there was a huge variety of businesses. You had about 3 lots of printing works there, between Harvey's in Georgia Street, you had Croker's in O'Connell Street, you had the News and Star, and you would hear the machines clattering away. Of certain evenings they'd be printing the local paper, and the Munster Express were very advanced kind of printers all their life. Mr. Wedge was always a man investing his profits back into the business,
And a famous character.
Yeah, a very famous man, yeah. But I tell you, you could have a tiff with Mr. Wedge, and 10 minutes later the tiff was over. He would never forget it, but he'd get on with it. He was nice to deal with. I always found him anyway in my life. And then you had Murphy Engineers, you had Johnny Deacon's in Bridge Street, you had Morris's Coal Yard, you had several more garages along, even to Mayor's Motors. There was a hive of activity along it. Like down even where we were in O'Connell Street, where we started first in 1946, it was Harry Sage was our next door neighbour, the barber, and then we had 2 brother and a sister. I think of their name now. They had a little fruit and vegetable place, and they would send off their fruit off to England through the shipping here at that stage. So they were very advanced people. And you had loads of course, pubs in the street. You had Tom Mars, where he lived there. I remember him kind of getting married, so that's not that many years ago when you got rest his soul and herself. And then you had Eddie Harney's pub, was a very, very busy pub always in the street.
Where was Eddie Harney's?
Just down there, do you remember where there's a Polish shop or something there now? Next, remember just beyond the City Cycle on the corner where you turn up. The Blue Haven, that was Eddie Harney's pub, and Jim Brennan bought it off him, yeah. And you had the City Cycle, and there were the 2 Griffins, Biddy, God rest her soul, and Betty. She's still alive in Slievrew, Hale and Harty, I believe. They ran the cycle shop all my life anyway, and they had a man called Mr. Patridge, God rest his soul. He used to repair the bicycles out the back. And next to him then you had an elderly man called Dick Phelan from Bilberry, and he ran a tobacconist shop there with his sister-in-law, Miss Parker. And he had already sold that pub to Eddie Harney back in the early 50s, I think, And then you had Jimmy Grant and his wife, caught, the 2 of them are passed away. They ran a grocery shop there next to Bowes, the butchers. And he did a kind of a van delivery. He was a kind of a mobile shop. They never stopped working. They were lovely people. Bowes were a very big concern in our time. And part of their premises was used for cannery, where they used to make can the meat, send it off to the British Army. And also, Denny's were also sending off the meat to the British Army. The big house at the end of the street where it was used for adult education, it's kind of defunct now, they've moved down the road. That was part of it. That was the house, and they had the granary or the cannery working there for many years in that.
So that was Denny's house? That
was Denny's house. And it was I have to try and remember the name of the man who Major. Do you remember Dr. Kehoe lived above in Lisduggan? Himself and his wife, he was married to a Denny, but they had no family, and that kind of died out then, the end of it. But Denny's were in O'Connell Street till 1912, and when they moved to the new site in Morgan Street, the little man called Mr. Quinn, he always said he was the last standing man. I think of his name now in a minute. Andy Quinn, God rest his soul. They had worked in Denny's in O'Connell Street, and he was still alive when Denny's in the Glen closed, or in Morgan Street closed. And then you had Collins's abattoir there. They were a very big concern. And you had all the sack and bag down through James's Lane. And the end of it, then you had Avery's Scales, where, it was a workshop there again. 3 or 4 people worked in it. It was a hive of activity.
Scales were a big business.
They were. And of course, up opposite where we're now in Thomas Street, you had Halpins, and they used to do all the harnesses and for the horses and everything. And they used to have this big white horse outside the door, just a model horse, and where it ever went after, outside it for advertising. And next to that was a coal yard, and eventually that's the vacant site now from, remember when the place burnt down, Udecker? That was a coal yard at one time next to them. So
the fire was...
Yeah. And where we are now, that was owned by a man called P.A. Wade. He built it. It was an old hangar he bought after the First World War in England. And he shared with Sheridan's Garage, he shared the Ford agency for Waterford. And when he died off, it was eventually then it was the fellow on the Tremor Road, Major Carew had it. He had the Volkswagen agency. And eventually, when I presume he gave up or sold out, it was a man called Heffron, and it ended up with Stephen Flaherty, who was from Passage, and he was the multi-millionaire from the Long Mile Road in Dublin, motor distributors. So it has changed hands, and it was with PMPA another time. So it is.
And just go back down to O'Connell Street again.
Yeah.
Go back down towards Red Square, is it?
Yes, yes.
So what was down that way? I mean, I remember...
That was all, the traffic was two-way in them days. And you had, of course, you had the Presbytery there, and before that, of course, you had the Harbour Board, which was a hive of activities, and also you had then the Chamber of Commerce were in that same building. And on the road along there, then you had Harvey's up the little lane. They used to have the clock out over it. Remember the public clock was out over the street all the years. It was the little lane going up to Jenkins Lane now. That little lane was very busy because all the workers went in and out that way. And then you had Halley's, the solicitors there, and you had Jackson Brothers. They were an outfitters there, where Johnny Vaughan was after. I think young Palmer's in it now, the music man, in the same shop. And then you had Cavendish, which was a very busy shop because they sold all furniture and household goods, and it was all on a kind of a weekly system. Everyone would have known they were great people for advertising. A man called Michael Hearn, do you remember his wife? Both of them have passed away now. She was the secretary in the De La Salle College in our time and your time as well, yeah. That was...
So Cavendish used to get things on the book?
Everything was on the book. I imagine it was an English company, and that was the idea. There were several salesmen, and they were out on the road, and they were delivering the stuff and doing all that. And then you probably, next to that, you would have had Phelan's, the butchers. And their mother lived over that one, I could remember as a youngster. And then I'd say we probably had John Welsh, Matty Welsh, the Welsh's bar that they call now. Yeah, they lived over that as well. And she was one of the Burkes for bicycles. Maureen was from across the road, married in there. It was neighbour, married neighbour, you know. And they're all gone now. And then I suppose you had Quinlan's, had 2 butcher shops in the street. All I remember the name was Cutch Quinlan. He's probably long dead, the poor man is. Do you know Trevor Cunningham? I'd say he'd be a nephew or a grandnephew of his, yeah. And then you had Phelan's, of course, that everyone knows, the tobacco shop, Mr. Phelan and Francis and Tony. And then you had the Evening Press office, where the paper would come in on the train and they'd do all the debts, the local debts and the local sports results and the news. Jim Faulkner, the undertaker, I remember Jim Faulkner working in there, yeah, that's a long time ago, yeah. And then you had a place called Hennebrys. They were a grocery and where Darrell stores are now, you know. And they had a side entrance in there. I'd say people in the days before used to take their horse and carts in and out for mine when they come to town, you know. And across the road then you would have had O'Neill's, I think it was the Savoy Bar. And next to that into Barnstone Street then was Goff's, the leather shop. And then down along there you had Burke's, and I'm sure I'm forgetting loads of them. You had the famous Hearn and Company, which was synonymous with, because they had a furniture factory in Jenkins Lane as well, as you remember when you were going to school.
The shop was much different. I mean, it was like a proper shop. Like they sold everything.
Everything, yeah.
But the furniture business was like church furniture, wasn't it?
Well, they made, I suppose, school and for church furniture. And they used to sell it all over England, apparently. They'd go off and fit the furniture in the... Because I remember some of the men there, you tell me they'd only be getting a little Black & Decker drill to go off to England, to Manchester or to Birmingham to start fitting church furniture. Nowadays, they'd be sending vans off and everything else, you know, they just got the boat across and did their work and came back. Remember Frank O'Farrell that lived in Corrigan Park? He used to tell me the stories about Hearns. So there's they got great tradesmen out of all these places, great training. And they would do all that varnishing and what's the other stuff, French polishing would be done in that place.
And the Savoy Cinema was there at that stage?
It was. I think that was built around the 1930s or 40s when it was renovated.
Okay, so let's go back then. On Gladstone Street, what was your memory of Gladstone Street? You mentioned the Penny Bank, did you?
The Penny Bank was there, and then there was Murphy's. They were the post office, and across from them there was Kaz, the paper shop. The Miss Kaz used to run that, and Miss Murphy ran the post office. And next to Murphy's post office was Galway's. Now they had a fantastic big business there in the street because they were wine merchants and they bottled the Guinness and everything else. They had a big workshop or a warehouse above in Meeting House Lane where they did all that.
Which is right at the back of Garth Lane.
Yeah.
And that burned down, too. It was a famous fire there, I think in the 60s or...
I don't remember a fire there now. No.
Hey, keep going.
And on the corner here, just across from us, that nice square looking building, that was Power Seeds. I know that burnt down kind of in the 30s or 40s, and John Hearn, the famous builders, rebuilt that. It's a beautiful job. They were there for donkey's years. They were on the Dunmore Road, and now they're Ballymountain. They do all the seeds out in Ballymountain, Declan Power. That's it.
And I saw pictures of them. They grew tobacco.
I believe, yeah. Actually, he's a right man to talk to, yeah.
Power Seeds.
Yeah.
And the Penny Bank, tell us just about that, because...
You could book, as far as I remember, you could nearly book a holiday off of Sean Power in there because I think it was all the one. There was a counter inside that you could go in and put in a few pence into it, and you got your little book to save your few pence.
So that was a couple of business people, the Jacobs and who else? There was, what was it,
Sean Power would have Harvey travelled there. Yeah.
Harvey's and the Jacobs.
Well, across the road from that then was Stan Furlong's electrical shop. I think before that was Welsh's, there were auctioneers or something was in it. But that's where Stan Furlong, I think Gibney's, there were wine merchants were on the shop next to that. And then of course you had, and I think of their names, there was a lovely pub there. The people used to, it was famous for cards, Quan's pub. That was knocked down, and Keller's, the solicitor. Quan's, yeah. I'm probably not pronouncing it dead on, but that's what it.
And then on the quay, who was on the quay? You remember when we said clock tower down the box?
Well, you mainly, I suppose, had the biggest people there were Hearns, Shaws, and the Granville. But the Granville at that stage wasn't anything like the hotel it is today, because I'd say it had gone down until the Cusicks took it over, whenever that was, you know. And yet Tyler's beyond that, and probably another few shops. Oh, Hearns had a shop there as well, and you had Tyler's on the corner. And then when you come down on the quay, I do, they were just alongside of it. That was owned by people called Pitts. They lived in Dunmore, and another one lived in Ferrybank. They were very famous people altogether, I believe.
Was that a chemist?
Chemists, they did everything. They had a place in Exchange Street where they used to, they made a lot of different I presume medicines, whether they were for horses or humans, I don't know, but you could buy anything in that shop. They were there, and they also they sold paint and eyes and colours and everything, the same as Sean Ryan's parents were probably doing at the same time, up in Barronstrand Street.
And then coming down to the next block then, what was that next block?
Well, you had Southern Refrigeration. They opened around 1946, I think. That was owned by the Austrian man called Kraus, and he got involved with the two, John and Jimmy Elbert, who were very entrepreneurs at the time. They opened Snow Cream originally, and then that's how they met Kurt Kraus, I believe. And they were the most successful outside Dublin people to pasteurise milk in the area, which eventually went out to Glenville then. They were in O'Connell Street. And you had, of course, Harper Brothers were a great hardware store on the quay, as well as Johnny Hearns, but they were just there. And also you had, what was the other shop? You had a chemist shop there. I'm not forgetting the name of it. Oh no, he was at the fair end. He was on Merchants Quay down further. But you had Carl's, the drapery shop there as well. And you had Harvey's had a retail shop on the quay there as well. And so did Croker's have another one further down the quay, down where part of Shaw's are now. No, that was Harvey's. And the one further down was Croker's one, down there where, Eddie's Dry Cleaners are on the quay, just around that spot. So there was a huge amount of family businesses and families living all around it. Like here next to us was Rita O'Shea, and she lived over that place, and she used to have a flat there. Ada Craig, she worked in Chapman's, which I've forgotten about now, on the quay. So there was a huge number of commercial and shops and offices, and even down to the Munster Expresses on that block. And over that there was several drapery shops was around there, small drapery shops. And there was a man in Tremor used to run, Mr. Shallow used to run an architect's practice in at the back of the Munster Express. And then you had, I think, Cooks and Hennebury were accountants on the quay as well, over one of them. So there was loads of work for everyone, because these people gave everything to the local economy. There was no such thing as head office send down a message. Everything was done locally, whether it was the builder was got in, or the electrician, or the painter. Everyone got a.
And then obviously, like you mentioned the furniture, the church furniture, the suites and the gardens. And then the other thing, obviously, the docks. I mean, the docks brought a lot of business.
Oh, huge amount of business, yeah. Sure, I remember as a youngster now, the lorries on the quay beyond natural, down the quay with livestock to the boats. And they would all be eating, and probably in them days having a drink, I don't know, but they certainly were eating and getting their diesel or their petrol for the lorries. And all the drovers that were paid to go up and down, and the people on the docks, and for all the different associations with it, where there were stevedores or dockers, they were all getting, and the pubs, of course, at that time used to open very early in the morning. They all had licenses, down as far as I presume Jordan's on the far end of the quay, to open for the dockers, They'd open at 7 o'clock.
The early houses.
Yeah.
And then the Quakers were still involved in the business of this area at that time.
Yeah, they were very strong, lots of families. Like you had the Hills, the Grubbs were the descendants of the Whites, and they were all cousins of one another, because generally Quakers married into Quakers. And then you had, what was the other people? The Chapmans. So there was a big lot of them. And of course, Chapmans had a big shop where they sold bacon and everything in O'Connell, where Paddy Delaney's florist was for years, and still is the daughter is there now. But they also had up this little lane there, it was called, I think, Gaffney's Lane. They had a place called Benson, Bass and Slattery, and they did tea purifying there. That's what they had up there. And also, they did all their own blending and everything else. And I remember them trying out remember tea bags came out, they were trying to make them a success on them. I presume they'd done it eventually, but that was run by a chap called Meyer, and his mother would have been a chapman, but they were all connected to one another, all the families,
And then obviously Jacobs were Quakers.
They were, yeah. Well, I'd only have known of them by name because I remember as a youngster over in Lunderkin's Bakery alongside the Dominican, their name was in Casta and still on the stoves over there where they cooked the ovens, Jacob, R&W Jacob was still on but they were all broken down, I suppose, when they built the houses for Respond over there, I presume,
And then they obviously moved to Dublin, the bakers moved to Dublin.
They did, yeah.
And became a huge success. And then, and so, I mean, I'm just talking about the Protestant and the Quaker tradition of, I suppose, merchants and all that kind of stuff. And I suppose, maybe around the turn of the century, the Catholic business people began to become more and more part of the scene here.
I'd imagine so, but they were the Quaker people were very honest type of, I'm not saying the Catholics weren't, but they had a very shrewd type of way about them. They wouldn't waste sixpence or lose sixpence, if you understand me. They were very, very nice people to deal with, terribly straightforward in their dealings. But I'd imagine after the 1922s or that kind of year, I'd say they started to down tools and started to emigrate. And I presume that's what happened most of them. With the exception, the Grubbs were left and the Hills and the Chapmans. But the Chapmans now, I don't know whether there's some of them around still, definitely. The families are all still, and so are the Hills and so are the Grubbs. John Grubb would be a descendant of, yeah. He'd be his grandfather, sure. It was very close, yeah.
And when did your family get into the electrical business?
My father started to serve his time in Keaton and Galls on the quay, and that was back in the 20s, I suppose. And then in 1946, himself and his brother Willie, God rest their souls, they opened up on their own in O'Connell Street. And in them days, in order to start a contracting business, you had to have a shop with it. They wouldn't supply the stuff, the materials, or at your proper price unless you had a shop. So they'd opened their own shop then. And at that time, there was probably 14 or 15 electrical shops in Waterford, So it was there was a huge number of electrical shops. As I said already, Stamford was in Gladstone Street, and you had Keaton's on the quay, and there was lots of them. And then my uncle went on his own. He was on the quay, and then he was in Michael Street. He had the shop in Michael Street. His son was Michael Kavanagh then, that I suppose most people still remember.
And your Cavanaghs up in Thompson,
yeah, they'd be cousins of ours. One of them, George, served his time in Keaton and Galls and lived with my father. In fact, he was there at the time the jail wall fell, about 1942, because they were feared that he had lost his life. But so he's passed away now, but his son Timmy runs the business now.
Yeah. And then, electrical business must have been very exciting at that time, because it was like a whole new industry.
It was, and then when my father and his brother, and I'm sure all the rest of them, they all started. They were working in DC, which was the old plant type, and they all changed into AC to get with what the ESB was producing, And of course, we had a competition at ESB as well, because they were contracting as well and doing all the normal things. They had a shop in O'Connell Street, which I forgot to mention when I talked about the shops in O'Connell Street.
And Waterford I presume this place was electrification much earlier than lots of other places.
Oh, I would think so, Ollie. I think Waterford was the first city in Ireland about 18-something to have electric lighting. But apparently it just go down low when the tide had come in, because the turbines or whatever they had on the quay wouldn't give enough electricity off them. And they changed back to gas. I remember reading that one time, yeah. But it was they must be very forward people, because when you think of Kent and all the different elections, they all came out of Waterford eventually. Kent was a Wexford man, and he worked in Keaton and Gauze, and then he went on to set up his own business in Clonmel, and the likes of Noel Dial started Sure Engineering. He set up out of my uncle's place on the quay, and there was many more of them. So it was, as they say, little grows into, yeah. And it was definitely a place for, people were very adventurous. And the Keaton and Gauze apparently worked in Kelly's. They were also auto and some kind of electrical work.
What was the funny place too, because we were very connected to the UK, weren't we?
That was, I suppose, our problem afterwards. I don't know.
No, I'm just saying that we were both from
Oh, yeah, sure.
Great Western and all that kind of stuff.
I was going out to Passage the other day with Mary, and I said, I remember when we were kids, my father driving us out to Passage, and the Colemans, the guard Coleman, the two girls were going over, the two daughters were going over to see their sister in Wales, and we drove to Passage in the van to wave at them going down the boat. You know, them days are all gone, aren't they? You know?
Well, we had that connection. I mean, lots of Waterford fellas would have gone over to work in England.
Oh, yeah, I remember when we were youngsters in school, I suppose a huge number of the children that we were with in St. Stephen's School, their fathers would have been working in England, and they'd only see him for kind of a fortnight a year. They'd come home in August on their holidays, and you'd be going back down there. We'd often walk down with them to the Clyde Wharf, where they'd be saying goodbye to them, then going back with their case. They wouldn't see him for another year. And that was a very common thing in them days, you know.
And even though it was a small city, it did feel something like a city, in the sense that, you know, I mean, you had because you had a port,
yeah,
you had all these comes and goings going on.
Oh, I'd say it was a very, very busy city. Sure, I remember when we were youngsters now, Galway was only a big town compared to Waterford, and it's gone the other way around now, you know, which is a pity. And it's not that people haven't tried, but the political willpower mustn't be there. I don't know what it is. It's a pity.
Yeah.
But sure.
And it was always a very blue-collar town, Waterford.
What?
Like fellas working in factories or working...
Oh, yeah, it was all, very working class people, I'd say it was here, yeah. Very much, because when you go down, even in the centre of the city, the number of factories and little places were manufacturing and making stuff. Everyone repaired everything. Like your neighbour up there, Mr. Hogan, was the tinsmith in Stephen Street was even there in your time, you know. Everyone was working and doing their bits. That was at the time when schools were built by the local builders. So it gave great training and prosperity to the area if a new school was going up or something to do with the corporation.
You were saying, you just mentioned Maurice Hogan, tinsmith.
Yeah.
But I mean, people wouldn't believe what Waterford was like in their childhood. And you were talking about, horses and carts and everything.
Yeah, should the CIE be in town every day of the week? They'd be coming in with the goods from the train. If we were buying a few fridges in the shop or televisions eventually in the 60s, and they'd be bringing them in on the horse and cart, lifting them in, and then every week we'd have this man who's coming on a horse and cart, and he'd collect all the rubbish from us. And he used to get us when we were kids to stand up in it, and we used to call him prance it down, because he'd say to me mother, get them to prance it down now, Mrs. Kavanagh, he'd say. And she'd pay him then probably a half crown, 2 6 or 12.5 new pence to be now. And off he'd go. And then there was another man who used to go around, the Hacketts, and they had huge big floats, and they used to deliver the beer around. And Galway's had another float, Mr. O'Sullivan, God rest his soul. He used to look after the horse, and he used to take him up the stony steps at evening then and leave him into the back of Galway's up there. They had a field in there, and he'd put it was a small horse, I presume they call him a cob, and he'd bring up on a little bit of a little grassy patch. Do you remember a little grassy patch going up on the steps?
And that's why you mentioned Mr. Halpin in Thomas Street.
Yeah.
But that's what he was there for, was to look after.
Oh, that's what I suppose, yeah. But then they had the Powers, the blacksmiths in Jail Street. They were that was their job, and there were several more blacksmiths all around the town, you know.
But it's really funny how, You say that someone they think, oh, geez, that must be 100 years ago.
No.
So it's interesting.
Even when I was a youngster now, Mr. Wheeler, he was called the town crier, but he was actually the watchman. And he used to come in then, he'd collect his money every week in the shop. Now, it was very small money. It was a fortune to us when we were youngsters. He was collecting sixpence or a shilling. But he'd check your door at night, and if anything was wrong, he'd have his flash lamp and look through the window, see it. And if he went around town checking the doors and checking the shops to see any place that people weren't living over, you know.
Wow. And what business you think about?
Well, it was a charge on it. Obviously, he had to live, but when you think of what people are getting today, to what that man worked for, you know. That was his son, Tommy Wheeler, was a great carpenter. Do you remember Tommy? A good singer as well.
Famous character.
Yeah, very famous, God rest his soul.
So any other kind of things like that would mark that time? Like, I mean, we're talking about, what about characters back then? Do you remember any of the eccentric characters?
I know, but sure, there was a man called Monkey Tricks, and they said he was shell-shocked in the First World War, and he used to be running from door to door, and all he used to sell was onions. And my mother would buy the few onions, lots of other people would buy the onions off. But then a lot of the place around where in Carrigain Lane, say, the first house there, they sold bread and they took in laundry. So they had made their living from that, and you had loads of other fellas in town that were names on, like Quack Dunphy and all them that I'm sure everyone has written about and read about over the years, that just go around doing odd jobs for people. And
I suppose people have to be very industrious. You have to be very active to make a living.
Yeah.
Try to get this and do that. And come here, what about the kind of, I mean, Waterford, we were talking the left over from a connection with England, but also the war and all that. I mean, the First World War, the Second World War, like, there was people around that you know who were in the war.
Yeah, but a funny thing, Oliver, most of them had never talked about anything like that. And like I remember there was an old man up in Jail Street, St. Patrick's Terrace now, Mr. Butler was his name. And I remember sending up a group of scouts, 3 or 4 of them that were doing something on history. And they knocked the door because he was a soldier in the Boer War and in the First World War. And he nearly collapsed because he thought it was the IRA after him. See, there was a lot of that in the too that you have to be very careful of. And people didn't understand. And they, like my grandfather would have fought in the First World War, but he was long dead before we were born. And they never spoke of it because it wasn't a thing to do in them days, because you had to keep their mouth shut. They went when it was good to go, and when the 1916 Rising took place, well then it wasn't a good thing to be fighting for the British.
But even in Waterford then too, there were certain families who wouldn't be talking to each other because of the Civil War as well.
I suppose so, yeah. I had an uncle in the Civil War, but he never spoke for it in his whole life, and he died. Actually, Dr. Jennifer's out in the college, her grandfather, Peary Kavanagh, God rest his soul, he was in Kilkenny jail when his mother died, and we had a little letter at home from the Dr. Purcell looking for his release, but it was only written on the day that she died in 1921 or 22. So you know there was that's Sean Cavanagh's face. Yeah, and he never spoke about it. And of course we weren't old enough to ask him the question. If we were, we'd have got a clatter in the ear and told to mind our own business. In our house anyway, that's the way it was done.
And you were mentioning that an awful lot of people lived in the city at the time, over houses.
Yeah, and over the shops. But even Oliver, up the side here, off O'Connell Street, was Sergeant's Lane. And in onto the right-hand side that was Sergeant's Court, in behind Power Seeds. There was a big tenement of houses on both sides of that street. And when we were kids now, I always remember a woman, and she only spoke Irish. So, you know, and that was in the 50s. That was still, when I made my communion, was I think the first time I ever walked down there, that was still cobblestones along that stage, and that was 57. And Flanagan's had a feather store there as well. You know, there was so much in business around the place, it was unbelievable. And there was no one afraid to walk any place or go any place, because there was you never heard of anything going wrong, you know. You didn't know of it going wrong.
Smells.
What?
If you walk
Oh, sure, I remember Stephen Street School, certain days of the week, Denny's would be leaving the offal off, wherever it was, and the smell would be coming through the windows when you were upstairs in the classes. And we went to the Delaside Cottage after, we got it so many times a week from Clover Meats over. So, you got them smells. And in the river, you'd see all the offal or wherever it was, blood and guts going down. And fellas would be fishing like mad to get the pike, they'd be up around it, or the mullet, they'd be all around that near the bridge. So there was always something going on.
And the brewery down Mary Street, did you ever go down that far?
No, the only thing I ever remember was they used to have they had their own wells there, and they would give out water. If there was a cut-off in the town, you could go down there and get fresh water if anything was wrong with the water.
And they did their own spring then?
Oh, they must have had a lot of springs there, yeah. That was a real thriving industry, as the iron foundry work out the road was just as much then. When you see all the men on their bicycles coming from work long, going in and out the roads, And we had a neighbour then of ours, and he used to, every so often he'd bring us in a fist of them nooks that you'd play with, the hard metal things, yeah. So it was, I suppose we didn't have very much, but we had everything at the same time.
And you were in St. Patrick's Parish?
No, we were the last house of the cathedral. Yeah, we were always the cathedral. The house next door was St. Patrick's. Yeah. But in fact, we used to always go to Mass in the St. Patrick's for Lent. We always went to 8 o'clock Mass when we were youngsters, I remember even Louis Doolan's father, the teenage Doolan, on his walking sticks with a big beard in them days. And when we'd be going to Mass, we met umpteen times. We would have met the Clancy brothers because they had bought that pub at the time in Tommy Macon. There was always, that was early in the morning to us going down to Mass. And there was always people on the road coming and going to work.
And the Mass then, those days, was it in Latin?
Oh, it was in Latin. Because we used to get an evening, once a month we used to go to St. Patrick's, all the school would be brought down, and it was for benediction, and the whole thing was all in Latin. And we used to be so delighted when the brother would say, down to St. Patrick's now. I'm not forgetting what we used to say, the prayers, but it was...
But you know what?
Oh yeah, we'd know them all off by heart. We didn't know what we were saying, but we were able to say them all. Yeah.
And did they ever do Mass in Irish?
Not in Stephen Street School, but they did it in Mount Sinai, all right. The Delasad brothers weren't very much into the Irish like they were in Mount Sinai, or the Christian brothers. But they have to say, the majority of them, if not all of them, were all nice men. We got on great with them anyway. They were into hurling and football and
then
scouts.
Where did the Dominicans start?
Well, the Dominican is not a parish. They were always known as the Black Friars or something they used to refer to them as. But they got a great following for all the area, and especially over Ferrybank and Sally Park and out New Ra would all come to the Dominican. It was a very busy church, but they were just an order church, the same as the Franciscans were.
So if you were from, we say, over in Thomas Street, you'd be going to the cathedral?
That'd be your parish there, yeah. And you go to Ballybrick, and then you were the old and half Gray's Jew. One side of Gray's Jew was the cathedral, and the other side was Ballybrick. And then I don't know what, when they split them, when the Holy Family opened then, because we went, when they were renovating the St. Stephen's School around 1962, we went to the Army Barracks in order to stop any carry on between the Mount Sinai boys and the Stephen Street boys. We had to go in from Newport Square into the barracks, and they blocked off the gates to the other end of it, so we couldn't meet with one another. And we were there for about 3 years when Brother Maurice was in charge. But in them days, it was mainly brothers were all there in the school.
And so just down around this end too, I mean, you were talking about, we say, the street, but then behind all those shops, there was other businesses going on too. You mentioned like
Benson, Bass and Slattery's, and you had, constantly you have, gone out of my head, they were hide and skin people. They were Dublin, gone, the name is gone out of my head, but they were there, and there was the...
And that was coming from, you say, all the outdoors and as well?
I presume, yeah. And then, of course, you probably had all the leather industry in Portlaw was getting all the carcasses off of the factories around. And of course the big thing was, in them days, we ate a lot of offal in the town. We had chuck bones and lime bones and ribs and pigs' heads and pigs' feet. You know, you just think the shops were selling it in them days, you know. And that was all from the byproduct of the bacon and the meat industry that was being exported, and we got the handy pieces to sell around town, I presume, you know. But
there was plenty of meat around.
there was plenty of meat. People were never hungry, I wouldn't say, really.
What else? I'm just trying to think about that. Yeah, what kind of like, what you mentioned, Dogfish. Did you mention Dogfish shop for the comics and all that? What comics and all that did you read?
Well, we used to get kind of the Beano, the Dandy, and the Beano Dandy. I can't remember. I think my sister used to get the Hosper or something else. She got the Bunty, yeah. And then there was a shop, of course, in Pass Street, would sell and swap comics. Hanrahan's, I think it was named, up from your pub on the other side of the road. You could go in and buy and swap. Shammy Power was a great man for swapping comics. That's what he used to do. Yeah, remember Shammy from the glass factory? Yeah. There's loads of places around, and then you go down, O'Neill's was the Moneyball shop, and Mrs. Hartree in Stephen Street. They all sold money balls where you could win sixpence or 5 pence. 5 pence in a little coin, or 3 pence, I should say.
Like it was in the middle of the street?
In the middle of the street, wrapped in a bit of greaseproof paper or something. And then you had...
So you eat the sweet, and then next thing
you'd probably chip your tooth taking it out. And then you had Mr. Darmody in Michael Street, who used to make loads of sweets, and so did O'Neill's, the Moneyball shop. There's probably others I'm forgetting, but... including your mother, they'd have all the hard sweets in the window, and she would sell potatoes and vegetables and everything in the shop. You think how they did it in the sweet? Yeah, toffee apples, red ones or brown ones you could get in season. And then we'd have all the conkers for out of the park, and we used to go to the park to collect the grass, because we always kept pet rabbits, and that's we'd get the grass down. I don't know, I just say we got a few of them at one stage. I say George got them, and then we ended up, we had people all over coming looking for rabbits off. We didn't ever seem to sell them, they were always just given away. We had so many of them.
But they're all pets.
Pet, they were all, we never did that with them, only rubbed them and minded them.
Because all places to shoot them,
yeah.
Trap them.
No, we weren't that brave, I don't think, to kill them. We often went shoot out getting foxes, but we never got one, you know, because they used to be 10 shillings if you'd got a fox's tail in the barracks, you'd get a 10 shilling note. What we used to do in them days is collect waste paper, and the school used to collect it and bring it out to Miss Comfort. The National Board and Paper Mills had do you know where Tom Geraghty Tires is now? They had a depot there, and we used to even bring them from our own shop. When we got cute enough, we'd be bringing out the cardboard, and we get in a check then after about 6 months for 1 and 3pence, you know. I forgot down in O'Connell Street now as well, you had the News and Star, and you had Kennedy's corn stores down there, which was a big outfit because they used to dry the corn, and they had a warehouse down on Grattan Quay as well as the sacking bags.
Okay. And the corn store, I mean, obviously, how I know it was people used to keep pigeons just around there to get stuff.
Oh, they get it. And we used to actually, do what we used to do for the rabbits? We used to go up to the CI had a yard in Bridge Street, and you go down there and you get a bale of straw to put for the rabbits. And you know, they give you the bale of straw. When you think of it now, you couldn't do that in 100 years. You couldn't go in and ask for a bit of straw. You'd end up getting a bale of it carried up on the bicycle then, and you had that for the winter for the rabbits and the dogs. And of course, if you had the dog, we'd all go down to poor Joe O'Brien in Stephen Street, and Joe would clip the dog's paws for you, and he'd cut the tail, or he'd give him any medicine you wanted. All that was all thanks Mr. O'Brien, or thanks Josie. And if you want, we used to have a canary in the house. We'd take him up in the cage up to Tommy Power, God rest his soul, the blacksmith, and he'd trim his nails for us, and he'd trim his beak and everything. There's none of that anymore, is there?
And these were just all like experts.
They were all just tanking jobs, the poor men, yeah. But how good they were to children in them days, you know, they looked after them well.
That's lovely.
And you could left in there, coming from school, you could go in and stand and watch them showing the horses. Health and safety wouldn't let it now. They wouldn't. Mr. Powell would be sitting at the fire and he smoking his pipe, and Petey and Tommy then got arrested. The two of them are passed away. They'd be showing the horses there away, not to bother them, cleaning them off. And you'd be left standing to watch all that, and the bellows would be, they'd let you pump up the fire. And times were easy, yeah, and simple. But that's about all of it around.
Thanks very much.
All right.
And I will call to you.
All right, Pat.
Hopefully this week.
Well, whenever, yeah, I'll jot out a few of them for you. And the ones that have the numbers.
Especially those older fellows you're talking, because when they're gone, they're gone.
There's an old woman, I say she's an old woman, she killed me. I can't remember her name. I used to meet her now and then when the husband was alive. She worked in Murphy's post office. She had a son, Patrick something. I think of her name now in a minute. He's a big shot in something in Dublin, because I meet him now and then, he comes into the shop. She's very good at knowledge to know all the shops around. There's a lot of them around still. And it would be well worth going out to Peter Hill. Peter is married to one of the varying brush crowd in Dublin. I think they were probably all Quakers. Is that turned off now? Oh, Jesus.